Can I get a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, so now that we have adopted the policy, now we need to verify that
Sorry.
our remote
Hi, this is
participant
Barbara.
voice is
Excuse
clear,
me.
audible,
get
and an appropriate volume for.
Candace, I think Barbara has a question.
Okay, Barbara?
Well, I was curious as to why those on the phone don't get to vote.
We haven't adopted the policy yet.
We have adopted yeah. We've
No, I
adopted
mean,
the
why
policy.
we don't get to vote on the policy?
Those are only members in the room. get to
Only
vote.
members of the room will vote on that policy.
Why is that?
Was there a question on the policy, Barbara? Or did you want
Well,
to make a suggestion to change something in it?
Well, I want to abstain on it. I understand that it comes from the county attorney's office and it's aimed at things like boards or the planning commission. I think a group like this, which is, as I understand it from talking to you, a much more informal kind of collaborative working group, not really a body like a board or a planning commission. I think that our goal is to have participation in whatever way works best. And I think this is the rigidity of this policy. Again, I know where it comes from and its intent, in my mind, works against that. So I was going to abstain.
Noted. Okay, so we do still need to do the next part, right? We need to verify.
Mhm.
Okay, so, we're verifying that our remote participants' voice is clear, audible, and at an appropriate volume for our meeting room. And confirmation of their location. So is it just Barbara today on the?
Barbara and Anna are on.
That's right, Anna as well.
online. And then we also have a member of the consultant team, just for FYI for you, Anna
Right.
Galicchio is.
Okay.
Galicchio?
So, Anna Shapiro, are you connected to this meeting remotely?
I am.
Okay, Anna, where are you calling from and where are you located?
I'm calling from Nashville, Tennessee.
Were y'all able to hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I move that Anna Shapiro's voice may be adequately heard in this location. Can I get a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Next, Barbara, are you connected to this meeting remotely?
Yes, I am.
Okay, Barbara, where are you calling from or where are you located?
I'm calling from my home in the Alexandria part of Fairfax County.
Okay, I move that Barbara Byron's voice may be adequately heard in this location. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Action number 3 is to verify that the remote participant's physical absence comports with the policy. Can I do them both at the same time? All right, so pursuant to Barbara Byron's and Anna Shapiro's policy for participation in meetings by electronic communication, I move that Barbara Byron and Anna Shapiro be permitted to participate remotely in this meeting because it comports with the policy we just adopted and a physical quorum is present here at DHCD. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. All set?
That's just a point of clarification out of it.
Sure, please.
Question is, do we have to identify the reason for remote participation? If it's a personal reason, then you have to note that in the minutes according to the policy, and there's a limit on the number of remote participations for that reason, as opposed to the other 3.
Correct.
participations.
Mhm.
Okay, I just missed that, sorry.
Yes, I mean, I think the minutes are being recorded via the video recording, so
So we're okay.
we're okay.
Okay.
I think Scott's point was different than that, Megan.
Are you saying that they need to
I think in
identify
the policy, they have to actually say why
why
they're,
they're.
they're missing the meeting, maybe getting to Barbara's rigidity
Mhm.
point.
Okay, well, I mean, then we just need to cite what the reason is.
Anna, and Anna, can you first, cite your reason for
Sure.
participating remotely?
Personal travel.
Okay, and Barbara?
A personal reason.
Thank you. Okay. Are we all set? Okay. So, the next quick item on the administrative items is we did want to note a small adjustment, that's already been sent out on our meeting dates. I think we'd originally said June 9th, but we've moved it to June 16th. So I just wanted to make sure, we kind of publicly, made that announcement. And then membership, we wanted to note that there was one adjustment in our membership. And Soledad Portilla is our new member, correct? Welcome. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're ready to move on to HRNA.
Yes.
Okay,
Great.
take it away.
Hi, everyone. Can I be heard pretty well? Everyone hear me? Anna? Barbara? Thank you for having us here today. I'm Callie Seltzer. I'm a principal at HRNA Advisors, and I'm joined by my colleague Rachel.
Hi, Rachel Waldman. I'm a director at HRNA Advisors.
And we're based here locally, and we work in the affordable housing practice. I'll skip to the next slide.
So this is.
Great. We can just, slide 9.
I think we lost the share screen now.
Oh, okay. Okay, wonderful. This is the team that will be supporting county staff on this project. The next slide. So our housing practice works with community stakeholders to create comprehensive housing strategies. We work really closely with counties. We write and design housing programs and policies. We do policy redesign. We provide the market analysis for a variety of housing related affordability issues. And we also do housing transactions. So we advise on the capital that's needed to preserve affordable housing. And across that, we consider our work to be housing systems approach. Next slide, please. So HRNA works all over the country and also internationally. But I think the affordability issues that you all are facing in Fairfax County are not dissimilar from a lot of other places where we're working. And we, see them as newly emerging in many of these markets, whereas 10 years ago, affordability was not sort of a kitchen table conversation. Next slide, please. These are just some examples of programs that we've designed around addressing housing affordability that are in conjunction with a public policy priority. And we've been lucky to work with Fairfax County on a few sort of not policy designs, but on some transaction specific work. And we're happy to be here today. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So what are we actually going to be doing with you all? So today we're going to talk just about the kind of basic economics of inclusionary zoning, just as a backdrop for this work and for the task force. Next slide.
Did we want to do, is that okay?
Yeah,
sorry.
On to this.
Sure, and then we can skip back to the follow-up.
Yeah, or do you want to do the data first? Sorry, yeah, we can do the data. Totally, that was the plan. It was to do the data now, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's do that. So all right, that's our introduction. We're gonna skip to some data and then we'll jump in with the economics. Got it.
Just. And just to introduce this, there were a number of Grace, and I'd like to introduce Abdi Hamoud for those who don't know. He is runs the homeownership piece for the WDU program and with his team. And we have been sorting through the last meeting and all of the different points that the task force made and also the requests for additional data following the presentation at the last meeting. Some of it was more readily accessible than other pieces. So we're going to present it as soon as we can organize all of the data. And today we have information about the question about who is buying the units. And Grace pulled together data related to household size, related to incomes, relative to AMI levels for the WDUs. And she'll be talking through that. We're also pulling together data that's not ready live today, but we're also pulling together data about the candidate pools and how large they are, who comprises those. So as that information becomes available, we'll be talking about that with you as well and providing that information. But let me turn it over to Grace to quickly go over some of the data about who is buying these units.
Great, thank you, Megan. So I think this is in response to some of the questions from this group about specifically about the buyers and the current buyers. We talked last session about 50 WDUs that have been available and 62 of them which have sold. We looked at data on those 62 buyers and some of the data wasn't quite clear. So I was only including 58 of the 62 buyers where we could actually verify the data. So there's some information that's not available. I will tell you right now, we don't have the job classification of each of the individual buyers. So as a group, I wouldn't know if they were like a teacher, a firefighter, or if they were, supermarket worker, or bus driver. I don't have that distinction. We don't have that in a database. It's in an individual client file, so we don't have that information readily available. The other thing that we didn't have was there's a question about the folks that are renting WDUs and then do those turn into WDU buyers, because we do market to the WDU renters. That's not something that we're currently tracking, the exact response of the WDU renters that we have marketed to. What's the response and have any of those turned into buyers? We don't know that. What we do know is sort of by feel that we've had a fairly good response when we do outreach to the WDU market renters. That we do get a lot of interest, a lot of callback and interested in the WDU For-sale program, but we don't have the actual numbers to sort of support that sort of feel, I will just say. There's additional research that HRNA is going to be helping us with to get a response to some questions, and that will be provided at later times. So here you can see the income of the actual buyers to the target WDU AMI, and this is actually the average the average income of the WDU buyer by the target WDU AMI. And I mean, as expected, the WDU 120%, the income required to buy those units is significantly higher. At 101 is the average AMI, or the actual income of the buyers of the 120%, and 61,000 is the average income of the 70% WDU. So I think that's no surprise. I think sort of more interesting is the buyer income by the target WDU. So that, I mean, the AMI of the people that are buying at each of the WDUs. So if I have a 70% AMI WDU, what is the actual AMI of those? So, and you can see at 70% AMI WDU that they were targeted to folks at 70% AMI. All of the five units there, they were all purchased by people whose actual income was at below 60% of AMI. For those that are purchasing 80% WDUs, there's, some of them were 60, some of them were 70, and some of them are 80. And we know that those folks, we had talked about incentives. Almost all of those folks will have qualified for the CDBG down payment assistance. So that is really why we think that the people at the lower incomes at 60 or 70 would be able to afford to purchase an 80% AMI unit. As we get to the 100 and 120s, those folks didn't really qualify for the down payment assistance, so they were really getting incentives from the seller. And so we don't see as big a diversity in terms of the AMI of the actual buyer. So there were fewer people at lower AMI, obviously buying the higher targeted WDUs. And when you get to 120% units, it's a really small pool of folks that can afford to buy those 100 and 120% AMI WDUs. There was a question also about what is the average family size of the WDUs by the target WDU percent. So we, from looking at the data, we see that the family size of the folks purchasing the 70% AMI units is much larger than those purchasing the 120. So almost 5 people per household in the 70% AMI units and only 2 people per household in the 120% AMI units. And one thing that we were able to really pull together really quickly together this morning, and thank you, Abdi and his group, is that what somebody asked about the applicant pool size. So, and who is not being served. So we have 356 people currently on the first-time homebuyer applicant pool. That includes everybody at all AMI and income levels. So 76 of those are at 80% or over. I don't have the breakdown of by each AMI, and we can probably get that information to you later, but the majority of the people we know are under 70% of AMI. We've had that first-time homebuyer program for a long time, and that word spread of mouth is, what helps build that applicant pool. So that's basically the information that I have.
And as I said, this is in an effort to sort of build the data that you all have as you're making, as you're looking at the analysis that we'll be doing, reviewing it, and beginning to work with us to formulate recommendations on the improvements. We're trying to make sure that you all have the information that you need to make, informed decisions on that. So again, we're trying to get the information that you all requested as we can, and here's more, and we'll be bringing forward additional data at the forthcoming meetings. Okay. Did anyone have any questions on that? And then I think we can shoot back to.
Okay, great. Giving it back to you.
Okay.
Get back.
Start. Talk through some of the economics, as I mentioned, of inclusionary zoning. But our goal with you all is to really figure out, you want to review the strengths and weaknesses of the program. How can we refine the product approach, and we really have to build up from the economics to get to those recommendations. To the next slide, please. So as you probably know, these policies have to be calibrated really carefully, balancing the public policy objective, which is affordable homeownership, with the feasibility, or else you have a policy where people won't actually build or sell the units, get stuck somewhere, in that delivery system. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, if not calibrated correctly, developers maybe not going to leverage the full development density, and maybe not build the thing to begin with. Or not hit the income levels that you're, interested in serving from a policy perspective. So when we look at these programs, a lot of the considerations around increased development density are related to parking. Can't have a meeting like this without talking about parking in the first 10 minutes. Rising construction costs, of course, approvals processes, and sort of the risk that's associated with a longer process or timeline for entitlement. and incentives, right? Because this is a voluntary inclusionary zoning program. And if you don't have the right incentives to offset the cost in some way, then you'll have a program that doesn't function to meet your public policy goals. Next slide, please. And when we look at feasibility of for sale development, and thinking about the sales price of that home, it's really based on the developer's cost to develop. And if you don't have the kind of the profit that's sufficient, so on the left here, the development costs, there's sort of 4 categories we've laid out. You've got your soft costs, your land costs, your hard costs, and also your profit, all of which has to be supported by the economics of the project. And also, it's important to keep in mind that developers that are delivering units like this, they often don't make that profit until the very end. Like they don't make it when they sell the first unit. So they have to see the whole picture of delivery and know that they're gonna be able to basically recoup and make their profit. And that doesn't happen in the beginning of their sales. It really happens at the end. We'll talk more about that. Next slide, please. So if you have an IZ policy that reduces the total revenue, from home sales, which is what happens when you restrict the income on the other side, right? The income potential of these units is deliberately less in order to get at affordability. You've got to offset that in some way with an incentive. So that could be, as I mentioned, increased density, and that just helps the developer offset the cost from that long-term loss of sales revenue, right? Like there's just not enough capital on the other side based on the income of your buyer to support the whole project. So here again, we have kind of the necessary development costs on the left. That middle blue box, you really have to have sales revenue that can support everything on the left, right? Like there's a blue dotted line there showing that those really have to be in sync. And then revenues from sales, including WDUs, because you're trying to support a public policy objective of affordability, creates that gap in that red box up there. And that's the gap between your development cost and that kind of public good that you're creating, right? So incentives help close that gap. And if it's not large enough or not calibrated correctly, developer just may not be interested in pursuing the project. Next slide, please. So when we look at these policy components and what makes a successful policy, there's really 4 main levers that policy can pull on, if you will. And it's the geography. Here we're talking about voluntary inclusionary zoning programs, not mandatory, but the geography is an important component of the policy. In some places, you have a very targeted geography. That's not the case here. The length of affordability. So how long does the covenant actually run? What's the, on the back end for a resale? What is your policy? And the minimum building size also very important. And then any in lieu fee options. Again, these are just kind of conceptual how we think of IZ policies. And then the incentives, right? So what are the appropriate incentives? What's the appropriate size of the incentives? Do the incentives, swell with changes in the market? And then what's the length of those incentives? And really what's the timing when a developer can actually get those incentives into the project? Earlier could be better than later. If they, if they're going at risk, they need to know early, like what's my parking requirement going to be? And do I get a reduction in parking? They want to know that going into the project, right? And then the last column here is just the policy, has to have administrative guidelines that are clear. So you have, approvals and program management and guidelines that are navigable for a developer. All right, next slide. So we're really focused on the first 3 there, but. So I don't think this will be surprising to anyone because perhaps many of you own a home, but when you think about that total sales price, on the left, right? So there's closing costs and then the actual cost of the home, how that translates and how that gets financed through a mortgage and through down payment or equity coming in from, the home buyer. That translates further to that monthly payment, right? So you're in the house, you get the house, now you've got your monthly mortgage and your principal and your interest, you've got your property tax, interest, utilities, and then any HOA or condo fees. I want to just kind of draw your attention to this monthly cost stack. Because that's a big part of what we're going to be looking at with the economics of what actually happens to owners once they're in the home. What do they need to cover? And are they housing burdened if, you know, something else gets added to that stack, right? Next slide. So here, just kind of building on, you guys know this, I think, but affordable, it's really always a question of affordable for who. And 30% of anyone's income, my income, anyone's income in here, whatever 30% of your income is really the determining factor of whether it's affordable for me. And that's your 30% includes both your housing costs and also any utilities. So you start to see that there might be a gap, right? If someone's income, in order to not be housing burdened, they're paying 30% in the pink stack. And, you know, the actual cost here between the mortgage, the property tax, utilities, and a condo fee can create a gap. Other things like ancillary parking, if you have to pay additional for parking, and if a window breaks, right? So all in all, your housing cost, your monthly housing burden needs to sync up with the total, you know, cost of actually owning the thing. So we're going to look at that carefully as well to figure out, you know, which households can't afford these units and why. In a very granular level, why? Is it happening at the mortgage level? Is it happening at the condo fee level? Is it happening at the parking? Slide, please. So a lot of tools, you know, but as I mentioned, you know, if the gap is happening because of a high HOA or condominium fee, how do you keep that in sync without, you know, kind of burdening the HOA or the association, right? How do you make sure that you still have enough fee to actually repair and, you know, maintain the properties? Second example we just put on here, and these are just examples, but you know, when the purchase of parking is separate, or when you actually have to pay separately for parking on top of all your other housing costs, that can be an additional burden. It needs to be actually factored in the total purchase price, because the end game for that owner is that their monthly housing cost of having the unit and having the parking spot they need is bigger. So we want to make sure we're looking across all of those individual housing costs.
Then on the flip side, just on parking, you could think about it in the inverse too, is if the purchasing unit weren't required to purchase parking, that just lowers the total purchase price, which lowers the size of the mortgage, which therefore translates to that home being affordable to households at lower AMI levels. So when you think about parking or other requirements that go into that are on top of kind of the sales price of the unit, it kind of works both ways, thinking about including it versus excluding it.
Yeah, we're very interested in flexibility around that. And next slide, please. Okay, so now Rachel's going to talk through some of the challenges. Wait, no, this is actually your slide. Okay,
Yes.
so we're going back and forth here. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, and this is kind of the meat of the discussion, where we've been sort of synthesizing what we've heard from you all at the last meeting to try to identify and really channelize what this task force is going to be tackling over the next few months, and make sure that we're in doing that, we can make sure that we're all on the same page with what the focus areas are for the improvements. That said, you know, if something comes up, you know, in the middle of the process, you know, we'll certainly, you know, be flexible and try to adapt. But we just want to make sure that as we begin our analysis with HR&A and we're talking with you all, that we're all on the same page with what it is that we're trying to accomplish in terms of the WD policy and program improvements. Based on the conversations at the last meeting and additional staff conversations, we whittled down the discussion to a few challenges that, and make sure I have that, challenges that I have on the screen here. And these are based on, as I said, the conversations that you all had at the last meeting, but also additional, there are a couple of them that we've recognized internally that we'd also like to propose that the group also talk about during this review. And make sure everything's good. So as far as the challenges on here, the group talked about the sales data and the challenges with the sales, the length of time that the sales, that the sales take, affordability terms, the WD pricing. And then we also haven't talked internally about issues surrounding bonus density and then also the geographic limitations of the policy. So just to kind of recap what Grace had presented and what we talked about last time is that many of the higher AMIs, the units at the higher AMIs remain on the market for longer periods of time. And, most likely that's, related to having the buyers, especially at that 120% AMI, that they're likely to purchase market rate units. And the restrictions of the WDMUs may make the units less attractive. And they also, as Grace mentioned, and even today, that those higher AMIs, they also need greater incentives for the sales to happen. In terms of the affordability, we want to look at, as we're working with you all, that we need to sort of work through it to see if that current 30-year mark is the right length to really create the permanent affordability and generational wealth. For sales price, we've talked about that the WD pricing begins to set the pricing at that maximum affordability level. So, and that sort of can create issues if ultimately, we need to look at incentives or other ways to reduce the prices or ways to get get the unit to sell. And then we also have, as Callie just mentioned, that there are additional costs to homeownerships that create affordability challenges related to condo fees or just sort of secondary costs. Now, I wanted I added on here the bonus density and the geographic limitations. One of the things that we've noticed, and if we can make room in the task force's schedule, we'd also like to explore how the bonus density works within the program, because as you all are aware, there is a sliding scale related to the WD units and how much bonus density is offered. And of course, what we've been noticing as the units have been coming in, as proffers reach us, that the units, that the bonus density in that sliding scale isn't being taken advantage of. That most of the time we're only seeing that the minimum amount of units that are necessary to provide are being provided. So we'd like to also, if as we can, take a look at that, and HRNA is going to help us with that. And finally, and this was something that came out of the WDU rental policy changes that we'd also like to similarly explore here, which is about the geographic limitations on the policy. Currently, the policy focuses on our growth centers within the county. So Tyson's urban centers, suburban centers, transit station areas, community business centers. And we'd like to take a look at whether or not that policy really should apply to other areas within the county that also may be planned for higher densities, stacked townhouses, multifamily, in the same way that the WD rental policy review looked at that issue during the last round as well, and extended it to areas that also are planned for higher densities. And then finally, you all are aware that there are special provisions within Tyson's for high-rise developments in a way that tries to encourage WDUs within high-rise, because those properties or developments are more expensive. But at the same time, there are high-rises throughout the county that are planned along the Silver Line, within Merrifield, Richmond Highway. There are other areas where we are or will be experiencing high-rise, and we wanted to take a look at if those high-rise provisions should be extended elsewhere. So not necessarily, to be clear, not necessarily relooking at those high-rise provisions in Tyson's, but really about its applicability elsewhere within the county where high-rise is planned. So those are some of the challenges that we talked about as a group or separately. And I should say actually before we go to the focus areas that there were some other challenges mentioned and that you all had talked about related to improving marketing. Great suggestions that we've had about ways to improve marketing and also about the RHA purchasing WDUs. Those are good suggestions. We would like to discuss those internally and sort of get our heads around what that means. And balancing it with resource availability as well. So those we don't have that listed as a priority for this group at this time. But I did want to at least kind of call that out because, these are great. We think that the task force has been really helpful in, at least in that last meeting, coming up with these ideas. And I certainly don't want to leave them hanging. So we're just putting them in the parking lot as far as task force work for now. But, there is discussion happening outside of this. Okay. So in terms of the focus areas for the group, I've listed 5 here. And I have dueling laptops, so if I not do my best here, but if I stop, just call me out on it, okay? This is why I didn't play piano. So I have 5 listed here. These were the areas that we thought would be priorities for the group. Of course, the main one that the board has called out is the affordability level. So looking at right sizing what the AMI levels are for the WDUs, WD pricing, and the resale components, geographic applicability, and then the terms of price controls. And what we're going to do today is go through each of these, and we're going to sort of have a tag team here with HRNA. I'm going to go through, based on conversations that we've had, go through for each of them, what are we trying to do with them? What are the goals that y'all have talked about? What are some of the considerations that factor into how we might look at adjusting them? And then also talk about, and this is where HRNA comes in, and Callie and Rachel will talk about what is the approach to the analysis for each of them. And again, we're going to stop after each of them and make sure that, hopefully this didn't seem too much like overkill, but in your packet, y'all have a note sheet if you wanted to write down your thoughts as we go through them. Because after each of them, we're going to stop. And, if you have questions, concerns, if we've missed something, if you had, in your mind had approached it in a different way, this is the time to kind of speak up on that. Because, we want to make sure that when what we've given to HRNA as the direction for their analysis, that it all makes sense to you guys. Because certainly the last thing that we would want is for them to come back after doing, their analysis and come back with findings that you all might, have questions about. So we may not agree with it, but for whatever reason, but we certainly don't want to question the process by which it was developed. So I'll just dive in here. So optimizing affordability, I have 3 goals on, oh, thank you. Okay, thanks, Tom. Optimizing affordability levels. So what we're talking about is that certainly the expectation right now in the county-wide WD program is 12% of the units, ranging 80, 100, and 120. As Grace mentioned last time, we do have more units negotiated at 80%, sometimes at 70%, depending on the area. And of course, we often have voluntarily the builders are going lower as well, just to make those units saleable. So we have the three goals here: avoiding competition with market prices, and making sure that we're matching that supply with the demand. and who needs the unit, making sure that we have those available units for them and that we're not oversaturating the WDUs in areas that we don't have buyers for. And then, and with that, we would be reducing any issues with the length of the amount of sales that we have, the length of time that it takes the sales to happen. And some of the considerations that are going into this, we're going to be doing a demand analysis. I think this was a big part of the conversation at the last meeting. So we're looking at the household size, the income data, relative to the AMI levels in the policy right now. Think through who needs the unit, where is that demand, and how does that compare to the market, and where is that optimal level for the WDUs. We'll also look at the challenges to home ownership at the lower levels as well, in addition to the other side of the spectrum. So we might look at condo fee, the introduction of condo fees, additional maintenance costs, down payment assistance, things like that. And then at the last meeting, there was some comment made about not making the ADU program too similar or the same as the ADU program. So we don't want to create an overlap between the two. And then, as I mentioned, we'll also looking at if there's a way to right size the number of units that are expected within a development with the bonus density to see if there are ways to better utilize that sliding scale. So with that, I'll turn it over to Callie and Rachel to go over the approach for this piece.
Sure. So the first place that we're going to start when thinking about how to optimize affordability levels is evaluating those supply side and demand side factors. And so well, on the supply side, we really want to understand the housing market countywide and how that actually varies between the product types and different places within the county. So we're going to be doing a survey to understand the type of housing that's available and how it varies by market, both in terms of product type and pricing. Understanding that the housing market dynamics in Tysons are very different than, say, the housing market in Springfield or other places in the county. We're also going to be, as part of our effort, going to be trying to understand development costs, because just as the housing markets themselves are different in terms of product type and pricing, part of what's underlying that and driving that is also differences in development costs, such as land costs, construction costs, et cetera. And so with that, we're going to start to have an understanding of the supply side factors that are really governing what is the housing stock in the county today. And then on the flip side of that, we're going to try to understand the demand side, or who are home buyers and how that varies by location in the county and different product types. And so we're going to look at changes in homeownership trends, household income, and how that's shifted over time and how that has affected who is and who is not owning a home in the county. We'll also take a look at just factors that affect a household's ability to own a home, such as interest rates, and we mentioned some of the condo and HOA fees that also affect kind of that monthly price. And then we'll sort of take those two together and try to understand at a more macro level in the county, where is the county supplying housing, and then where is the actual demand for housing in the county, and try to understand where those gaps actually are. And then once we understand where those gaps kind of exist countywide, we'll actually overlay it on where we're seeing in the WDU program, where units are being offered and where units are being bought, trying to understand where the market for WDUs might be converging or actually differing from what we're seeing in the housing market more broadly. And so that'll be kind of the first step in when we think about how to optimize the affordability levels, is just really understanding kind of the housing market more broadly.
How granular is that zip code, or how are you gonna?
So we're going to look at it countywide, and then there are I think we're looking at 4 specific submarkets that we're working with the county to identify to understand how both supply side and demand side factors may vary.
Other questions?
Sounds perfect. Well, if you think of anything else, as we're going through this, we can circle back at the end.
Again, if I may, on a really critical note, that I'd like to bring up, we are bringing lunch in and I understand that it is here, so I wonder if maybe we want to take a quick pause to do that. And
Oh,
come
yes.
back. So
Okay.
I think maybe, is that all right?
I think that's a great idea, yes. Okay, we will, take a, what, 10-minute break?
Yep.
10-minute break.
Did y'all hear that on the remote side of things? We'll come back in 10 minutes, so it's 11:57, so 12:01, 12:03, sorry. 12, we can add in. 12:07.
Alrighty, if we're ready, we will jump back into it while we also.
Did everybody get a lunch that was adequate? Okay. Right, and Anna, Barbara, would you mind just giving me a thumbs up that y'all can hear us? It's, okay, I see Anna. Thank you. Anna's plural. Thank you very much. Here. Okay.
I know.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go ahead.
All
Get
right.
started.
All right, so the next bucket that we're going through is looking at the WDU pricing. And I should say we, as staff, are working on this currently because of the recent changes in interest rates. And also the county just approved effective July 1, a tax rate decrease. And then also looking at condo and HOA fees and how that factors in. As we're looking at these different factors and change, kind of adjusting them, we want to make sure that the prices are going to remain affordable to different households, depending on the household size and income, as we've talked about, and that we are reflecting the variety of different factors that go into affordability. So not just looking at on the factors that I mentioned with the income levels and the household sizes, also looking at the interest rates, and the tax rates and things like that, which are factors that affect how we calculate the prices, and then also looking at the additional costs of homeownership in terms of the condo fees, the HOA fees, kind of the secondary costs as well. Oh, thank you. Now I have my lunch too, so I've got I've got lots of different. Okay, so considerations. As I mentioned, the current calculation maximizes the affordability based on the HUD approved income limits, and we adjust that with by the household size and other factors. You all might be aware HUD recently, just this week, announced the increase in the AMI for the region up to $152,000. And of course, we're also recognizing that that may not be equal across the income spectrum. So if there is a way to factor that in, we're going to take a look at that as well. Let's see. So, and I mentioned earlier, we are also with HRNA's help, we're going to look at how construction costs factor into the pricing. Currently, we maximize based on affordability, not so much the construction cost, but our policy does say that that should be looked at, because ultimately maximizing it with affordability means that we're at the maximum level. We don't necessarily need to factor in those construction costs, but we would like to take a look at that. And let's see, so mentioned condo fees, HOA fees, those are based on the structure type and the type of construction. So we were talking about, perhaps there could be maybe a dual system, one that looks at condo fees versus one that looks at HOA fees. And since on average, HOA fees are less than condo fees due to the levels of amenities and that so that's something that we're taking a look at now and looking at averages across the county. And then one thing of note as well, right now our pricing assumes that one parking space is provided with each of the WDUs. And the price is based on that. More recently, we're beginning to see that parking is decoupled in certain areas, especially, Tyson's and, those areas that are really amenity rich, transit rich, and people aren't necessarily needing to have a car. So we want to also take a look at, if, is there an option too, where if we're getting proffers in where parking is not required with the unit, would we want to take a look at adjusting our prices also adjusting the assumptions to potentially remove parking, and then thereby lowering the cost, and then having, the option, we would still continue to have an option for purchasing parking, but maybe it's not automatically built into the pricing formula. So do you want to, I'll flip it over to you then with the approach.
So to think about the approach, I'm going to go a little bit back to thinking about this in terms of like supply side and demand side. So supply side, when we think about how are we going to right size the pricing associated with different AMI levels, is understanding development costs. Because as we mentioned earlier, one of the keys of having any successful policy such as this is being able to balance the cost it takes to develop with the revenues it takes to make development feasible, factoring in incentives that offset lower revenues from reduced sales prices. So what we'll do is we will understand the pricing dynamics for what it takes to develop different types of housings. The cost structure to develop a high-rise is very different from the cost structure to develop a 2/2, for example, and understand how that varies by market. For example, land costs in Tyson's are very different from land costs in other parts of the county. And so once we have an understanding of what the development pro forma, so to speak, looks like for different development typologies, we'll look at the demand side, or translating based on incomes and housing market factors in the county, how that translates to what is the price of housing that families can afford different AMI levels. And so what this will take into account are things such as interest rates, tax rates, information on HOA or condominium fees, depending on the type of housing, property taxes, et cetera. All the different factors that are going to go in and actually affect what is the monthly payment that different households at different AMI levels can actually afford. And then based on those factors, how that actually would translate into a supportable sales price. And so what we're going to understand is those two factors, the cost to develop, as well as the supportable housing prices, how those two balance and how that might translate, keeping these two sides of the lever in check, how that might translate to where we think we can adjust pricing for different AMI levels. And so kind of in building that pro forma analysis and understanding what we call the purchase capacity calculator for households, we'll also test how different assumptions, particularly on HOA condo fees and parking, might actually change that total sales price, and how would that affect the balance with development feasibility. Questions on that?
We could show you the math. It would probably make more sense when we try to talk about math. It's like a mouthful.
Are there any questions from the remote group? Okay.
Looks like we can move on.
Okay, so moving on to resale. At the last meeting, we talked a little bit about resale and the challenges with the resale components related to the resale pricing. And the difficulties that we were having, especially with the higher AMI levels for resale. So as we look at the improvements to resale, the resale components, we want to make sure that there's equity between the initial sales price and the resales price. We want to reduce the impediments and the barriers for those that are trying to resell their units. And we're looking at ways for the RHA to facilitate resales. And I did mention that we're having additional discussions outside of this about, and we will be having them about the RHA's involvement in the resale process and the purchasing process of resales. So, and as you're aware, our resale prices are based on the CPI, and we look at increases over time with that. So we want to make sure that we're looking at how we set the WD pricing at the beginning to make sure that, you know, we have the right calculation, the right formula, which we just talked about. But also that when we look at the resale, we want to see how, you know, how it would compare the resale value utilizing the CPI index with what is the initial sales price, or what would have been the initial sales price at that time. So we want to make sure that we are balancing it so that it is a fair calculation. So with that, I'll turn it over to you all.
Sure. So with the resale components, the first thing that we're going to want to understand, just from a pure data perspective, is when we look at historically, how have, from market perspective, home sales prices increased over time, and then compare that to just CPI over time. And what we expect to see is a divergence in how those two have changed. We're also going to want to look at that at a little bit more of a granular level, not just total sales price growth, how that's varied by geography, and then as well as product type. Probably since the theme of how we're going to delineate and break up our analysis. And one of the things that we're also doing as part of our analysis that we think, particularly in trying to understand best practices for resale, is we're going to be doing some case studies of for sale WDU programs at other jurisdictions, both locally, such as in Montgomery County and in DC, as well as potentially other national analogs. And so one of the places that we're also going to really be looking at our case studies is trying to understand how other jurisdictions have dealt with this idea, this resale problem of balancing the idea if you want to be able to allow households to build generational wealth, but you also want to keep these units as currently affordable. And so how have other jurisdictions kind of dealt with that same question?
Any questions?
Real quick, would you look at, or do you think we could look at just pricing as it relates to the WDs versus what the pricing does of the market rate? Is that part of the?
Oh, yes, yeah, yes.
Do you mean for the resale in particular, or
I'm
do you
saying
mean
it's
just
as far
for
as the setting the pricing to be successful? It's got to be enough of a, you know, value. And so, you know, not just going on a monthly payment, but also looking at what is the market rates they're selling for. That goes to the community basis. And I don't know if that's too rigid or too tough to manage for the housing authority, setting the pricing for just something.
Well, we absolutely want to do that. I mean, you know, that's been part of the challenge, right? Because if the market price is the same as the WD price, there's really no incentive for a buyer to purchase that unit. Well, there may be, but there's a lot of paperwork there. I mean, there are barriers, if you will. So, you know, they typically, the buyer would go to the market because that would just be easier and more attractive than having to go through the WD process, especially with the commitments and the covenants that are associated with it. So, yeah.
On the resale side, though, the idea is not to so price appreciation.
I think it would be what we would be shooting for in our analysis is what's the right balance? Because you're right, we don't think that the resale price for a WD unit necessarily should be what it would be at market rate. for that same unit because that does not necessarily align with this idea of permanent affordability. But at the same time, if you want to think about how can we use housing as a way to help build wealth for households, that maybe the current method of CPI isn't necessarily promoting that goal either. And is that also potentially deterring people from purchasing these units in the first place because they know that they can't necessarily use it as a way to build wealth later on? And so what our analysis is going to really look at is there a method that threads that needle perfectly, or is it going to be a question of trade-offs? And so this is one of the reasons that we also think it's going to be really important to not just look at the data in Fairfax County, but actually look at how other jurisdictions have answered the same question and seeing if there are any key takeaways or best practices that we could think about here in Fairfax County.
So if the goal, the homeowner gain from the market appreciation, that's the goal of owning a WDU answer that. Because it could be also like credit building, like other things that, you know, more than like how much money they're making when they're pushing it out. You, an incentive for them to buy one. I'm just asking.
Sure. One of the things that I know, oh, jump in. You want to jump in on that?
Yep.
Yeah, just really briefly on that. You know, I think you've hit really on one of the big challenges here relative to buyers at 100 and 120% who, you know, look at the drawbacks versus the comparatively small discount off of market and ask themselves, what am I sacrificing relative to equity growth? But then you look at the buyers at 70 and 80%, and they're seeing it much more in terms of housing cost stability, credit building, et cetera. So there's, you know, I think what we're seeing in terms of our customers is that there's like this dichotomy between the two, and that's one of the challenges that's driving, you know, this issue.
The appreciation. It's been like, how do we get more people into a different income level? So I don't know truly if the appreciation is one of the reasons why they buy a home. And I didn't just, I mean, I don't know the reason why people are buying the double.
Well, there's also a physical component. One of your charts showed it. So with rental housing, very rare to get 3 or 4 bedrooms. And your lowest, you know, the 70% AMI, your household size is like almost 5. And I think once a family gets a certain size, and I think in our rental market, especially around here, the units are getting smaller, and there's hardly any 3 or 4 bedrooms. So they might be treating as a physical asset, the lower end WDUs as basically a rental. We don't have build to rents here because they're too expensive to build. So there's a physical component to it as well, but yeah, there's no, if we're capping the appreciation, you know, the real appreciation is basically 0, that's CPI, then that's not going to be, you know, what the demand going to look for, because they don't cap, so they might be just looking for more services. You know, where they can do it aside from renting a house, a single family house on the open market.
Yeah.
Compared to the mortgage.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I think I was talking to people about this on the break too, and I think it's the same chart that Eric saw. I think a lot of the questions, when you look at that one chart where it said, you know, 419 days on the market at 120, 4.8 size versus 2, 670 to 120. Some places with crossovers, what has to be, where's once the incentive change from, I want to build equity to, I just need to save the home for things. With resale is, I really don't want to leave here. I would take permanent affordability. So somewhere there's some.
I would turn to our friends from HRNA and ask, you know, do you see a path in your work to kind of identifying where that line is?
I think one of the places where we would start is also, and this is where we want to understand, just kind of outside of the WDU program, just the housing market in general. Because one of the things that we have a hunch and that we want to dig into is that if there is sort of a wide selection of homes that are available to purchase, that's affordable to those that are at 120% AMI that aren't necessarily that, yes, maybe the initial purchase price of the WDU is slightly less, but if this home is still affordable and I can make up the appreciation in a few years, that sort of incentive might push someone to maybe not choose to use the program and to choose to purchase a market rate home. And so that's one of the things that we're gonna wanna look at, try to be able to at least give us kind of, at least from a data perspective, an initial idea of where that breakpoint would be, is actually understanding just what's available in the housing market in general and how options for households with different AMI change based on pricing, just kind of within the county and then specifically within certain submarkets.
Well, and that's the next question that I also figured out in the first hour is that WDU applies to high school urban centers and a couple of other places. I don't know, it's not countywide. Did that? So when you're looking at a lot of these, I guess you have to focus on those areas because it's really different in prices as it is in West, even though there might be high rises involved there. Figure out what mine is. I guess. All upset.
This is like we said, we think that's important to understand the dynamics countywide, but that we will sort of be focusing in on a narrow. But I do know that at least one of the questions that I know Megan will get to in a little bit is this idea of geographic applicability. And do we want to extend certain components of the policy countywide? And so while currently the policy is concentrated in specific geographic areas, we do know that there is this question of would it make sense to expand? So kind of need to look at it at both levels.
We do generally think that, you know, your potential buyers who are at 120% of AMI have other market options available to them. And weighing, you know, the choice between living in an urban center and using this program or wherever else they end up. And it's very hard to know, you know, the counter narrative there. But that's the income band we have to really zero in.
That AMI option. Also in the
Exactly.
broader region.
Right. And so it comes down to your own kind of preferences around.
And if you look at the core that I don't know how much there is this relation to this, but also, but we kind of stereotype is that higher paying jobs are a little more flexible with work location, especially in a hybrid environment. And so we look at the geographic bounds of, you know, we operate under the premise that, you know, people at 120% AMI not only have more purchasing power more broadly, but also more geographic opportunities for geographic mobility, whether it's within Fairfax County or outside Fairfax County, moving further out, or getting different product types, sacrificing maybe some flexibility in product type or cost, but moving closer in to this community. I mean, I think that's when you're really getting people that are, you know, the market, just the vast number of the number of choices that those potential home buyers have are so much greater than as we, you know, incrementally get further and further down the income spectrum.
And yeah, and related to the chart you had shown, Grace, that people that are actually below that AMI are still choosing those units and they're paying more than 30% of their income to live in them because the options aren't available.
Yeah, and I think there's an additional component that wasn't really captured there, and that's our eligibility determination, our underwriting criteria for the WDUs is a little bit different than our first time home buyer program too. So our WDU underwriting criteria allows people to go up to a higher debt to income ratio. So we know that those folks that are 60% of AMI and that are purchasing those units are probably like 45% on ratios. And so we know that they're burdened.
Yeah.
Want to move on?
Can I make a comment as well? Sorry. don't know if you could see my hand raised. This is Anna.
Thank you, Anna. No, we didn't see it.
Oh, no worries. So just one other consideration, just as we think about the different AMI levels, the time that folks purchase, or households purchase a unit, they're it's sort of point in time snapshot of their income, right? And so we know that incomes will likely go up over time, but we also know that, incomes at 100 and 120% AMI will go up more rapidly, because even if you think about sort of a cost of living increase kind of spread evenly, it's always a percentage. So at the lower income levels, you're going to have a lower kind of yearly increase, and not to mention a number of other factors, but like just that's one consideration, that somebody buying a home today, maybe, they're thinking about it for the future too. And if you're at 120% AMI, you may be thinking, well, I make this today, but maybe in the future I'll make, I think I'll make X. Whereas somebody at, 70, 80% AMI may have a different, that might be a different analysis for them. So I think it's also important to think about kind of that a home buyer's, kind of understanding of their income potential as well, not just that sort of the day they buy.
Well, that's a good segue into the the geographic applicability to last conversation. So I don't know that I need to explain this anymore, since we've brought it up so many times, but we are looking to see if we want to expand beyond the development centers, as was done in the WDU rental program, because the question, it sounds like in many inclusionary zoning programs, it might be by structure type rather than any particular geography, where you're looking at, you're trying to sort of match the higher densities with the program and the provision of the WDUs, not just, some potentially arbitrary geographic boundary. And then we also want to look at whether we want to expand the high-rise policy, which is right now limited to the Tysons area, to other areas that are planned for that type of density. I think I've covered all of the consideration points. Okay. I would echo that, especially, if there are any concerns about what it means to have higher density over, outside of the designated activity centers. I mean, a lot of these areas are older communities that are on major corridors as well. So we are talking about, places that do have good access, typically to bus service, to major arterial roadways. So the higher density does make sense in some certain places outside of the mixed use centers. And then when I talk about the higher density, I mean, we're really talking about, potentially, mid-rise or stacked townhouses. So just to give you guys a kind of a feel for when we talk, density is relative, right? Density in DC is different than density here. So we are talking about, areas that might be planned for stacked townhouses, mid-rise, that are outside of the development centers. So.
Similar, I think a lot of the approach that we are using to answer through this particular question is a lot of what we had discussed before, is understanding both from development feasibility side as well as just from an affordability side, kind of how things vary between different areas of the county, and if there's an opportunity or if it would make sense taking those into account to expand these different policies. One thing that I do think it's kind of important to maybe highlight is that a lot of the considerations and then a lot of the approaches that we're taking for each of these different themes, there's a fair amount of overlap here. And so I think that something that I do just kind of want to highlight is that while we're sort of talking about each of these different factors independently, they really kind of all are interconnected. And so as we're sort of undertaking our analysis, even though we're kind of describing our process step by step, really, all of these different considerations do need to sort of be looked at together in order to be able to fully understand and craft kind of the best recommendations for updates and changes to the policy.
We flip back to that challenges slide just to illustrate that a little more. I really like your challenges slide, Megan.
Let's see here. It might be faster to go this. Oh.
I think when Rachel's saying, these are interconnected, you want to talk about like sales, like sales, WDU sales is related to the sales price. The length of sales is also related to sales price. Do you want to?
Yeah, which is also kind of related to, I don't think I see resales here, but all of these and bonus density is related to WDU sales in the sense that it has to do with development feasibility, the geographic limitations. It's also kind of tied to sales price that, well, these are kind of listed as like 6 distinct challenges. Really, in a lot of ways, they're all actually interconnected. And I think that that's sort of, as we're thinking about how we're going to be structuring our analysis and kind of answering some of these like really key questions, it's sort of important to keep in mind that all this is kind of, let's say, a sticky web, and it can't necessarily be one set of analysis and one set of recommendations is going to address this particular point, because there are other factors and other challenges that you're going to have to consider crafting the policy.
So I think our job is to understand how these are all connected, to understand what's the whole bundle of what developers are thinking about and caring about, and how their financial picture comes together. On the buyer side, what's the bundle of things that they care about? We can't totally know, their own utility function around, like, would they rather live in DC or, Tyson's Corner? Like, we can get behind some of the math. And then, altogether, how should the policy sit to address those things in tandem? So there's a better alignment.
Okay, so we just have one more. So the last bucket that we have is to look at the term of the price control. So our goals here, we want to create WDs that are permanently affordable, and also the ability to build generational wealth. So currently our terms are 30 years for WDU for sale. We talked at the last meeting about that the term itself is renewable, so that does create that level of permanent affordability. We want to make sure we take a look at what are the best practices for this, for the terms. And we also, as a sort of a data plugin, we want to look at the number of ADUs and WDUs that have resold before their term has ended. And we're plugging in ADUs because it's a more established program and there have been more resales. So we just want to get a sense of, what might be the average length of time that somebody is living within the home, and trying to understand sort of what might be that timeline. And we also have had some variability at point in time, as we had the term was 15 years as well. So we'd like to consider, that, data surrounding that too, and what were those resales like as well. And I think at the last meeting as well, we were talking about, could we also look at maybe a longer term and what that would mean? So maybe expanding the 30-year term to something like 50 years, or I don't know, I think 99 might have been mentioned as well.
Are you looking at going beyond the CPI increase?
For the term,
Resale price,
we have to take a look at it.
so that's part of this scope.
Yes, I'm actually reselling that part of it. Do you want to talk a little bit about the approach?
Sure. We had, I think, touched on this earlier when we were talking about the resale prices, but and sort of thinking about how do you balance kind of the length of affordability with, again, sort of these two ideas of permanent affordability, but the ability to create generational wealth. We, in addition to sort of the analysis that we're looking at to kind of understand how home prices have changed over time relative to CPI. Again, I think we mentioned that we're going to be doing interviews and best practices case studies. We think that in sort of understanding the term of price control, that there's a lot that we can take away from talking with and understanding how other jurisdictions in the area, how they kind of set their term of affordability and what are the other factors that they use to govern resales, to see if there's any key takeaways for Fairfax.
One more related question I had, is, I don't know if you can, I don't know if this is more of a best practice case study from else, but if you allow the people who buy these to have more appreciation, are they willing to pay more for them upfront and therefore help out the economics for the developers? Make it happen more. I don't know if that correlation can exist somewhere. That the prices themselves will increase in the beginning because you're giving them a new benefit. But you know, they're not treating this as just basically a rental. Never gonna appreciate it.
That's something that I think we could take a look at, but we'd also want to make sure that when we're thinking about that we're sort of balancing affordability on the front end. And so this is where there's this tension between kind of affordability and kind of price appreciation. Like I think that's sort of an area, and that tension is where I expect that we'll sort of spend a lot of our time really digging into the data to make sure that we are kind of putting forth recommendations that balance those two things as the best that we can, because it is really, really tricky, because kind of inherently those are in conflict. Right?
Question. And the board initiated or created the WDU classification. Was there like a mission, like statement of saying this is what the intent and what they're trying to accomplish with it? Was it like a clear like goal that they were trying to do? And then the reason why I was just, it might frame our perspective of our engagement here. If the goal was accomplish this and going in a different direction, or if we're going in the same direction, I don't know, but that would be my question.
I might be able to help with that. I can say that at the outset of the development of the WDU program, the vast majority of the focus was on the rental side of it and capturing rental affordability in these construction types that to which the ADU program was not applicable. I at the risk of, you know, unintended candor, there wasn't much thought given, you know, to kind of the downrange implications for home ownership relative to these income levels. I think, you know, there was sort of this assumption that they would be administered in a manner similar to the ADU program. But all that is to say is that I'm not sure that there's any particular dogmatic attachment to administering these, you know, the WDUs one way or another, at least not from the origin of the program.
Okay. Then the follow-up question would be, does it make sense for this body to at least get an agreement on that before we start going down the path of all these other meetings, just to say, okay, here's exactly what the ADU program is, and then what is the WDU program and how does that fit? Versus, I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. Does it make sense to have that discussion, or do we just kind of continue on with and kind of formulate it throughout the meetings and where we end up going? Because I guess I'm kind of, you know, it sounds like we're looking at, you know, generational wealth, but then, you know, permanent affordability, and they kind of conflict to each other. So it's like, what's the mission of the program?
To that same point, you should get sense of the income targeting piece as well. You could say, well, we serving this range of income spectrum because we want to meet unmet market needs. And when this market analysis comes out, it'll tell us what the specific market needs are. But that's a little different if we're saying like, no, just as a matter of principle, we want to be sure that there's some committed affordable housing at various income groupings, regardless of where the market, not necessarily regardless of where the market is, but this is less about like the more narrow tailoring and more about sort of the broad spectrum that can maybe withstand market cycles. I'm not putting my thumb on the scale one direction or the other at this point, but it is a sort of first principles conversation to the same point about what do we want the benefits. So there's who we want to serve, and then what do we want the benefits to be to whom we are serving. Those are sort of interrelated pieces.
And to do that, you almost gotta know what is the WDU, ADU program do? Well, how much is that serving? And how does that fit in? You know, and then where do the ADUs come in? Because I don't know if everyone fully understands exactly when does an ADU actually even show up in a rezoning, you know, because a lot of times it's like, no, it's ADUs unless you hit a certain density bonus where then you start having to supplement into WDUs. And, you know, I do this for a living, but even I'm a little bit fuzzy about exactly when ADUs and Ws kick in. And it seems like it's always a moving target. So I don't know, maybe it's just reading material that we need to come up with on our own and like get educated. I know I do. But it just seems like that would be a helpful piece of the equation. Maybe the next meeting, I can initially steps, you know, before we really dive into it, is really showing exactly what are the different, you know, what are ADUs? What is the term of that? How does that work on as far as when you can sell and what you can sell it for? What is currently the WU program? When can you sell it? And then what percentage of, how many ADUs are out there? How many WDUs in a given year are generated through the rezoning process? When did they kick in? I just think that there needs to be some initial, at least for me, I need more education on when they kick in terms of the different programs, or these two different programs.
I certainly think we can do that. And Bill Malin, who's within the zoning administration division, you know, I know he can recite the entire zoning ordinance. You know, that said, though, I just want to point out, you know, with the ADU program, you are talking about certain construction types, right? And as Tom mentioned, when or there's a number of units, right? It's 50 or more. So you know, the WDU policy comes in to fill the gap when there are exemptions, and to a certain extent, you know, we're not. I think that the pieces that we're talking about right now are you know, we'll be recrafting and evolving the WDU policy to make it a more useful program. And the things that we've been talking about with the, you know, potentially eliminating the 120% or looking at the geographic area aren't necessarily saying that it's now going to overlap with the ADU program, because you have ADU also, I mean, it addresses lower AMIs as well. And I think we've already recognized that in for sale units, there can be challenges at those lower AMIs. So, you know, we may not go fully down into the ADU realm. So I certainly, you know, I can talk to Bill at the next meeting. And that's a good segue too into the question of like, what is the next meeting going to be? But you know, we can go over the differences. I just want to, I do want to sort of put it out there that because these are dealing in construction types, we don't necessarily, we won't be really talking about creating, you know, a lot of an overlap in that, because we still will have the structure of, you know, you have your ADUs and the requirements of the zoning ordinance. And if you are exempt and you're not, or if you're not meeting the county goal of 12%, you know, the WDs come in and fill that gap. So, you know, so again, you know, it is a supplement, WDs are supplementary. They're not, it wouldn't be taking a place of those, of the ADU requirements. I mean, that's not on the table for us. The zoning ordinance is the zoning ordinance. We're still going to be doing the ADUs.
Tom had something to say.
Just really briefly before we move on to the next meeting, I would just say as well that, you know, we've got sort of multiple kind of bases here that we need to cover. You know, one is the incomes being served. Two is, as you've rightly put it, sort of the mission here, and is, you know, are we, you know, going to evolve that mission to have, if not total equity, you know, like have it be more like, you know, just regular equity, but is the equity less limited, for example? There's another piece that I sort of feel compelled to, to mention about it as well, is that part of the issue about continued affordability of these units is that they are being produced in part because the county is granting additional density and ensuring that the downrange value of that additional density, that we're getting the benefit of the affordability is very important for us too.
And part of the conversation and the goal today was to you began your kind of commentary about what are we trying to do here? What are those goals? What is the mission of this group? And we've put out the general kind of expectations for the group, and we would like to sort of balance the ideas of permanent affordability and generational wealth. It doesn't. I mean, I'm okay with having those two goals together so that we can say these are two principles that are important to us. And I maybe what we can do between now and the next meeting is, because I know we recognize that this is the first time that you're seeing this presentation, and kind of having the chance to think about what are we actually trying to do here, and to the extent that we can, kind of compartmentalizing issues, even though we know that there's a lot of overlap. So at the next meeting, if we want to kind of look at the goals for the work, and talk about that, we can put some time on the agenda, and we can talk to Candace if that's worthwhile, for trying to figure out what are we trying to do here, and where are we trying to go? Because again, if we're not on the same page with some of those basic principles, if we do have kind of disagreements later on, I think we don't have the principle or agreed upon principles to rely on.
To that point, I think that in terms of like how much time you put on the agenda, like next meeting versus throughout, I think that I know, sometimes I've been part of these working groups where you spend a bunch of time up front, hashing out what those core goals and objectives are, and that guides the rest of the process. I view this example as a little bit more iterative, that maybe next meeting we kind of illustrate the possible, the list of possible objectives of different things we might prioritize. But what we will want to prioritize and set as a common, objective and goal is largely going to be informed by that market study and what we're seeing in the comparisons with the market. I mean, there are going to be some things that are more universal, and each of us might have different perspectives on the different trade-offs and balances within there. But I think I view my perspective, unlike some of these other sort of more blue sky, we're creating a policy from scratch or taking a global overview of our existing policies and trying to rework things. This is really an existing program with an existing framework, some elements of which are up for conversation, some of which ADU versus WDU are not. So I think it might work better from this objective perspective to do, we did have this level setting conversation about making that list, but then having it be more iterative and just a conscious part of the conversation throughout, that as we come towards the end, then we're, really give a lot of thought that is informed by the new data that's produced about where we should be prioritizing things and where we land on this. Just my 2 cents.
The last slide that we have is a good way. I know we're about at time, so we were just going to take a moment to talk about what the process looks like. So if you all.
Sure. So today is sort of kickoff and talking through kind of our overall approach to the analysis. We'll spend the next 2 meetings really talking about our findings from our case study research as well as our housing market analysis. So I think a lot of the work that we'll do that will sort of help inform kind of these major goals, if we do sort of choose, if you guys choose to sort of have this iterative process. That analysis is really coming in sort of this first month or so of the project. And then in July, we're planning to at least come with some of our initial findings, just based on our analysis, and then really kind of using the summer to really refine our recommendations, sort of based on what we're seeing in the data, conversations we're having with people in the market, our case studies, as well as just conversations that happen kind of within this group as well.
Or is any outreach to current WDU people that have purchased WDUs part of the scope, any surveys or, so it gets to sort of what have motivated people to purchase a WDU, what they thought the barriers were, is that part of the scope at all?
So as part of our scope, we are conducting outreach, and so we've sort of left it somewhat open to the kind of groups that we will reach out to. Of course, we're gonna need to reach out to a lot of people who are home builders, realtors, et cetera. But if there is value in reaching out to people who actually are purchasing and owning these WDUs, that's something that certainly is within our scope.
I think that would be important. We're speculating and we can like come up with those cutoff points for what we think people's motivations might have been for especially those who were more discretionary WDU buyers. But if we might get more results by asking for it. And then I guess my only other question is, I mean, this is potentially informing a policy change. Are we required to be doing any general outreach to the public at large? Or is this because it's a more in the weeds nuanced policy shift? Is that not a required part of the policy?
We will ask that additional, outreach be done. I mean, especially if we're talking about changing policy in specific areas, we would want to do outreach in those areas in particular, or if there are business groups or property owners within those areas. But I think the larger outreach efforts will happen really during the plan amendment itself, because this is really just keep in mind, this is the first step. And, as a panel of experts, we want your opinion, representing the industries that you represent. And then we will have the next step of the marking up the comprehensive plan, and we'll be doing additional outreach then as well.
Tom, you want to say something?
No, actually.
You're good. Perfect.
Had one question about, I guess, the scope of work and how we're looking at the changing housing market, and that we know in Fairfax County with interest rates, market supply, rising construction costs, is like what a huge shift that's been, I guess, since the introduction of the WDU policy. And if we're able to kind of like test over time, maybe somebody who purchased in 18 is really different than potential purchasers today.
Right.
Yeah.
For the same house.
Right,
Different
right.
buyers, right.
Okay, any last comments or questions before we adjourn? Megan, anything to add?
And I was gonna say, are there any questions from the remote group? Or anything to add?
No, thank you, Megan.
Well, then, we'll be back here on June 16th.
Thank you all very
Thank
much.
you all. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Start really start digging.
Yeah.